Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Karishma. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I can't thank you all enough for stepping out on a Sunday morning to attend this talk and activity. Thank you. As Karishma mentioned, I'm here to talk a little bit about my memory practice. I'm a memory studies practitioner independently and also at Srishti, where I have started a memory lab. To begin with, why memory? It has suddenly sort of captured our collective imaginations across the world, and most universities have a memory studies, either a center like IIT Madras has one. A lot of technological universities are starting the memory lab. So I'm just going to tell you about why I thought that was important. This is roughly the scope of memory studies. It by all means is not all encompassing, but these are the few salient points. Engagements with memory, collaborations, events, workshops, publishing. So I also run a By Kids for Kids publishing outfit called Timbuktu, spelled with ending with T double O. And so my latest book, The Inheritance of Memory, on which this presentation and activity is based. The book was released and published by Timbuktu. Curating for Culture and Center for Public Archives is something that is an outfit that I've been collaborating with, as well as Ririti. Many of you may be knowing of Ririti. They are into museum curation. These are the few conference presentations where I've looked at memory through different lenses, through place, ecology, digital memory. There's something called memory in transit, which looks at how memory can change with time and how our recollection of the original event can change because we change as people. An oral history project where I'm looking at family elders as historians in the house, and can they be looked at as repositories of lived histories. This is an ongoing engagement for me, and I think it's extremely important. The today's activity is also linked to this. So this is how I went about cataloging lived histories. So first I wanted to look at family elders as, like I said, repositories of lived histories. And can young people look at them as family historians and therefore to establish and develop a sense of their own individual history and a better engagement with themselves and their identity? So, this turned out to be a very interesting activity because these are the events that family members that I found had sort of lived through and so it's no longer something that's out of a history textbook. It actually becomes real and personal when children find out what is their lived history's legacy. It also encouraged younger generations to engage with older generations, particularly during the COVID years. All right, so this is how I went about it. So you begin with oral narratives, which is interviews, you can video document, there's a process finding from orality to textuality. And then when you collect data from descendants and children to find out, has the fulcrum shifted at all? How do they view personal histories now? How are they finding history in school? Is it becoming a little more personal? I started collecting artifacts. So that's another way, material memory. That was another book that came out by Timbuktu. I was looking at traditional studio houses, where families used to go and get their pictures taken. And they used to be like beautifully elaborate, carved interiors and backdrops. And I was always very intrigued by those vintage studio houses. So this is a passport from colonial times. It belonged to my grandfather's father, and he got it in 1926. So this became an interesting artifact to study, to look at the language of colonialism. For instance, I'm sorry, this is upside down, but I'll show you in a later slide if I can. For instance, it says British subject by birth. So if you look at the language of colonialism, you look at the calligraphy, you look at the text, sometimes it's in English, sometimes it's not. So these artifacts can also lead to a better understanding of history. And something like, a term such as positionality then comes up. Uh, for young people to then relate to and get a sense of their own positionality. So these are all some historical, some letters, correspondence with respect to jobs. There were some family elders who had to move to Lahore and therefore had to learn Urdu and pass an examination. What did that mean? Once again, to understand the language and communication of those days. So all these became part of the memory project. This was really important, and I call it the seen and the unseen in artifact study. What is the seen and the unseen? So what you see is Cleopatra's Needle. This is a famous landmark in Paris. Now, if you look at the stamp, it is 1945. Now, there are a whole lot of questions that crop up over here. So questions related to World War stories. So if this was during the war, what did it mean for a brown person to be in Europe at that time? What was the experience? What does it say about various aspects? How do we acknowledge our own privilege when in other parts of the country, our country, maybe people were dying because they were fighting a freedom movement, for example. So it's very important to relate to questions that come up. We won't always have answers because, we didn't live in those times, but I think that's important for documentation. These are some vintage letters going back to 1904. It also talks about the struggle that Indians had to face to secure a good employment. Now, the Indian civil services were largely dominated by the British. So, if for a brown person to actually be able to secure a position, how much harder did you have to work? Those are also questions that come up. This is the Maharaja's emblem, and this is a forefather. If that was Madras presidency, which was under colonial rule, this, Karnataka was under the Mysore Maharaja. So it becomes important to, I think, compare what was it like working for a British government and how did that, differ from, say, working for the Maharaja, which is not foreign rule. How did the two governances, how did they differ? Yes, so this was also another book that came out under Srishti's. We have a project called Art in Transit that works in the metro stations, mostly Cubbon Park. So we came out with a series of booklets about stories of Bangalore. And this is a memory related to an elderly aunt of mine who in 1944 recalled that it was the day the war ended and the Allies had won. So she remembered that in her class, the class was given an assignment of drawing your interpretation of VE Day, which is Victory in Europe Day, 1944. And she recalls drawing this scene of people in processions holding flags, blah, blah, blah. Once again, we did a workshop around this and we spoke about how we need to decolonize certain memories because this is, at the end of the day, yes, we were colonized, but it was also a foreign war that many of us were fighting. So, this is my first conference, a place for memory and the memory of place. So, how I approached it was that, in India, we tend to bequeath many things to children. But actually, more often than not, the main thing that we as a culture bequeath is memory. And then how can we then leverage that to make that so much more meaningful? So that's actually how my oral history project documentation began, by realizing there's so much more to the memories that just an afternoon spent with the grandmother, the kind of memories that can throw open and what that could mean and why they should be documented. With time, I found that there could be so many engagements with memories. There was a tech art workshop at Ranga Shankara, and this was a collaboration with Be Fantastic. So they are at the intersection of art and technology. So this was a play that I had written some time back called The Time Traveling Octopus. And so Future Fantastic had also, they had been working with certain AI generations. Through the workshop, they wanted to look at comparing the two results, human creativity versus AI generated creativity. So we workshopped this with a lot of children. And then we looked at, and the insights that were thrown up was that, okay, you can use AI generated, devices, but how close is that to your imagination? And it was so delightful that the children's creativity far surpassed anything that AI could throw up. And I think that was a great conclusion to the workshop. So by this time, my project had luckily, gone a certain distance. This was at the Goethe Institute, 2023. So these are all vintage film posters from my father's collection and grandfather's collection. But how do you package it for a younger generation? I brought in some interactive technologies. So, for instance, if you scan this picture, now this is the renovated version of an old ancestral home. So, you can see they've made flats and all that. So, if you scan this code, you can actually see the house as it was in the yesteryears. So that was one thing. This was using AR, and this is a stamp collection. So this user, the visitor to the exhibit, by scanning, he could actually hear. It was a voice-driven, experiential moment where he could hear the owner of the stamp collection speak about his journey in collecting stamps, even certain interesting tidbits like how those days in the 1940s, how did people actually get a stamp collection? They actually had, similar to a pen pal kind of a system, they had a platform where they could trade and exchange stamps. Um, Also, what was interesting in this audio narrative was that some of the names of countries had even changed. So all of that became like a really nice interactive experience. This became a workshop at Goethe where we had three generations working together. As you can see, this person is young, this is her aunt, and together they pass down a memory from person to person. And this is what I'm currently working on. It is like my passion project because I think memories and these anecdotes, family narratives should not die down with one generation. And then it resulted in this anthology, The Inheritance of Memory. If anyone is interested, you can contact me. I can email you a PDF. It was written as a set of intergenerational letters passing down a memory. It could be a recipe, a song. There are partition stories in this. People have chosen to speak about saris and fabrics. There's a recipe that came from across the border, and the current owners of the Queen's restaurant. You all may remember the Queen's restaurant in Church Street. So they have also contributed via letter writing from the grandmother to her 8-year-old grandson, who may or may not take the Queen's restaurant forward, but it was important to carry forward his family's legacy. So it started off Dear Pratima, which is from her mother, her father, Rakesh Arora. So he was the first person to come from across the border. And then Pratima carries this forward to Punya and Pratna, who are her children. So this is how the book was designed. This is the previous book which came out during COVID 2022. It's called Precious and it's based completely on material memory. That is also something which is really nice for families to take on over a weekend. So I'm just showing you a couple of pages to see the curation. Each child had to sit with a family member choosing a particular object in the family, like an heirloom or something that has been around a long time. After several discussions, this is what the kids came up with. So she was talking about her grandfather's vintage car. This is in Rajasthan, and there's a story to it. The Maharaja of Bikaner had gifted it to someone. Yash speaks about a Jadao which has also migrated. So essentially, this is like a personification story. That was the brief. You have to write it in the first person through the lens of the object. So it's in the first person. So the object is speaking, and the object takes the reader through places, people, what happened, what did the object witness. So finally, if you look at an object as a fly on the wall, it is a repository of memory itself. So that was the idea behind this. So this is Palangori, as many of us call it, and you would all know. And how we designed the book also was to have like little landmarks, a sort of a delicate map. It's a sort of a line illustration treatment, and this was launched at the Bangalore Literary Festival. And this is a perfect image of a memory that's been passed down. There's a grandmother who came from Lahore. This is Mrs. Arora, her daughter Pratima, and her daughters Punya and Pratma. This is a lovely partition story. And this is the grandmother's feedback about how she felt about the engagement. So I think it's also important to document, as data, the feedback that you get from either generation. How has it worked for them? So that we know whether it's working or not, the difference that it's making. And this project is also going to schools so that it can be brought into the curriculum as a better understanding of history. So I personally believe that history should start with a personal history. These are a couple of things that happened at the Bangalore Design Week. Once again, it's about documenting family narratives through objects. And now I'm going to very quickly go through other aspects wherein we looked at memory as part of our Srishti curriculum. I did a 7-semester project, which was called From Silent to Social, which looked at the history of communication down the ages. Students had to map advertising decade by decade, communication and media, but it was not as simple as just the advertising. They also had to look at the style of communication. And for instance, if you look at this, you mean a woman can open it? What did it say socio-culturally? It threw up, questions about gender, about equality, about gender roles, about sexism. So it opened up a whole world whereby we looked at the past in order to deconstruct it. And then they had to recreate these ads for a topic chosen by them, recreate the visual language also. So this is an example of how we mapped each generation right up to the present day, where we looked at things like hashtags and how brands have acquired a more of an activist voice. So this is a very different look at memory, the lens of memory. This student had chosen the topic of privacy, and privacy is a big deal today. So she was mapping it down the ages and how we looked at the culture of the neighborhood as being the primary source of information. If you remember when, at least my generation, when we were growing up, I think a lot of youngsters in the room may or may not identify, but we had neighborhoods where everyone knew everything about everyone, because there was just a wall, a very low wall separating. It was not the gated community of today. So this student recreated the film poster kind of a creative, and she used like popular songs and all of that. And if you look at this vintage look, so these were very interesting. This is a very interesting campaign. This is how we started the memory lab at Srishti. It was a grad show day, and similar to what we're going to do today, except that the topic was postcards to your younger self. So we created this postcard, and we had attendants who actually filled in the postcards. And it was like, if you could write something to your younger self, how would you use memory and nostalgia to communicate to yourself? What would you have done differently? Are you going to give yourself a pat in the back? Are you going to berate yourself? Are you going to console or comfort yourself? So I think these conversations are really important because of how we engage with the past. Okay, so now I'm going to very quickly race through memory and ecology, which is now a subject that really fascinates me because we always connect memory with human beings. So this is a non-human engagement. So I went on a trip to the Western Ghats, and that was completely life-changing. We looked at the community called the Haki Pikis. Some of you may be already familiar. So they are forest dwellers who live in the fringes of the Bannerghatta forest. Some of them are nostalgic for the days gone by. They've all been rehabilitated now by the government. And with them, the old ways of living are also dying. I sensed a sort of a conflict. Should they remember or should they actually move forward? Now, many of the youngsters do not want any documentation. They don't want to even live on the fringes of the forest because the internet connection is not so good. There is an intergenerational struggle happening with the forest community. And then this is Mr. Ganesh, a forest officer. By the way, this journaling was done by my students on the study trip. So he first introduced us to the topic of the wood wide web that many of you may be knowing. It is the underground communication between trees. And that was just mind boggling as to how advanced and intelligent non-humans are, you know. So if you look at the enmity going on in our world compared to them, where the trees look out for each other through this underground communication, and they send nutrition to one another. And if one tree is dying, it sends signals, and then the other trees take care of it. They grieve and they mourn when that tree dies. And then when a new tree comes up, they then look out and look after the new plant that comes up. So it was just amazing the stories we heard about the wood wide web. This is a question that came up. How does natural evolution and instinct then interact with memory? Because if you look at the fact that there's a bark on the tree, there was some very sharp spike. And then we were told that that is a natural defense that the tree has against predatory creatures. So then these became like miniature narratives within the larger narrative. So this was lovely story of a symbiotic relationship where the lac insect is allowed to feed on the sal tree, but they have an understanding. The lacquer from the lac is actually extremely protective. It's a protective sort of a layering, and that's how the tree benefits. And one of our colleagues, John Matthew, has a farm, which is a fabulous example of man animal conflict and how memory plays a role. How do you keep boundaries? How can boundaries be remembered? So, for example, the farm is adjoining the forest. Can you expect an elephant or a leopard to remember that this is the farm and that is the forest? No, you cannot, because it is the human being who has decided to build a farm on the outskirts of a forest. So, as a result, John gets a lot of unwelcome visitors. His dogs start barking, and sometimes they're eaten up by leopards. So, this kind of a conflict is always happening. Some more example of journaling. So, this is a lovely story which I saw. So, there were John's farm is full of birds, right? So, there was this duck waddling around, and 1 minute it was there. The next minute, that bird was not there. So I had noticed that the bird was not there. And I was kind of wondering. The next minute, I see the farm's dog has arrived with blood all around his mouth. Now, how is one supposed to react? Given this subject matter, can you blame the dog for attacking the fowl when it is the nature of the dog to attack the? So the dog is not doing anything uncharacteristic. So that became another subject matter of great interest, and it went on and on as to through whose lens can you see this incident. So John has lost a fowl that's obviously dear to him, but at the same time, he said that he cannot train the dog to not attack the fowl because that's going against the grain of nature. So there are no easy answers in any of this. When you go into a forest or you go to see a forest community, there are certain biases. You think, okay, they are going to live in, say, a mud hut, or they may not be advanced, or they may not have an internet connection. So all the students first had to address their biases and assumptions. So that's really important to leave your lens of privilege behind and actually acknowledge that, yes, I'm an urban dweller and I come with these biases. Another thing which I think young people should sort of keep in mind is how do you give back? And a lot of ecologists at Srishti are very particular about this. They do not encourage picking up anything from the forest. That's one, because they believe that everything is a part of the ecosystem balance. Then how do you give back? Because the forest dwellers have given you their time. The forest officer has given you his time. John has given you his time. The NGOs have given you their time. So we then went on to make certain design interventions and plan a pop-up around the experience. Yeah, so this is my band of students, information design with the forest officer. This trip completely changed my life. It's in the Western Ghats. We were very surprised and we were asked by our ecologist, why are these roots on the surface level? This is an example of the memory of a forest because the forest leaves clues for us indicating that at some point there was a flood, there was water. Now the water is no longer there, so the roots become visible. In a simple form, that's what it means. And this is from an earlier visit to Majuli Island in Assam. It's an island that is under the threat of being, flooded. And so we call this project Binaries of Existence because it was also about identity and belonging. Okay, so another example of migration and memory was when we went to Kukurebelu recently and we looked at the painted stalks. Fabulous stories about how the parents of the stork sometimes just fly away, leaving the stork behind to commence its journey whenever it feels ready. So there were this and several other stories of migration and memory. And how do these storks, how do they come back to the same place in the breeding season? They apparently go as far as Siberia. Um, Another thing is that the locals believe that they are married daughters who return to the parents' house because they come back in the breeding season. They connect it to a married daughter who comes back for the delivery to her parents' house. This is a joint collaboration with St. John's Hospital and the S.L. Bhatia Museum. And I'm very glad that hospitals now are getting into what many of you all will know as the medical humanities. So even the hospitals are looking at storytelling. So these are a list of all the people who presented at this museum. So what I decided to do was that I wanted to investigate the infant mortalities in families and why there is this climate of silence around it. In fact, I was fairly grown up, I would say, when I heard that my father had a sister who died of meningitis and we were not informed. Nobody spoke about her. She just like became this anonymous person who was referred to as the child who died or the third daughter. Vague abstract statements like that. So recently I found out that she was actually 2 years old when she died, not stillborn. So therefore she had a name, Prabha. She was walking, she was talking. She had a personality as 2-year-olds do. That's when on a recent trip to Bengal, where I came across the Dutch cemeteries, I was really left in wonder as to, those epitaphs on the gravestones were so beautifully written. The children were also very young, like sometimes newborn to 5 years old or 10 years old, but they were really made to feel like people. They were not they were not relegated to the past at all. So I wanted to bring in that aspect. So I called her Atte, as in Tamil we say father, sisters, and Atte, and the aunt who never grew up to be. So she had the potential of being an aunt. And here there's a picture of Loreto Convent in Lucknow, where she would have gone if she had survived because her older sister went there. And so this is a sort of expose on the whole aspect of anonymity and why we should talk about the dead and not sort of, especially for today's generation. So removing the shroud of secrecy. So I combined that a sort of a family narrative element with medical research in the same vintage newspaper. I thought that would be a good piece of creative to hold it all together while presenting. So this is a history of meningitis, and there are some research facts about the age group, which part of India, why was it hard to cure, which hospital, so on and so forth. Okay, thanks for listening.
It was really great in terms of putting together memories, allowing for people to access it across generations. But beyond the research itself, how does this take shape in, say, our current realities? For instance, I have a friend who did some research on, something to do with Bangalore lakes, and when they were looking at it, they realized that where cows typically tend to sit right now in Bangalore. Genetic memory wise, that was around the lake. And we don't see most of the lakes, they're all sort of, we have, many, many hundreds of thousands of lakes, and most of it is now covered. And there was some sort of conversation about reviving lakes and things like that stem from it, and many more things like that. I'm sure from the people that you speak to, you might find, say, unique designs or, say, architectural sort of structures, lots of which may not be documented, may have been forgotten. It could be a recipe that we don't see at all today. Any number of those kinds of things, cures, remedies that were all, from that time. Do you, how do you see your work and the curation that comes from it actively sort of now taking shape into real things that we interact with? Have you seen, do you have a story like that to share where something that's forgotten from the past has been revived or, yeah?
So I think that's a great question. So one particular project that has actually come to life, done by someone I know, is that of heritage homes, um, heritage establishments. So on the streets, what they are currently trying to do is by using QR codes, you can, if suppose it's a door number like say 54 and that's still there, you can actually see what historically stood there before the current establishment. So that is one thing that is currently happening. Also, in terms of lakes, since you mentioned it, one of my students has just been working on Belandur as a neighborhood. So she is also using interactive technologies and interviews with old residents like the post office, um, a municipal office, to find out the history of the neighborhood. So, and she has actually created an app for all newcomers because now it's this huge software hub. So, all newcomers to any gated communities have this sort of historic orientation. So, these are some sort of interventions that people are coming up with, definitely. And as for lakes, I haven't personally worked on anything, but I know that around the areas around Srishti itself are a hub of activity. So um, there are these walks and activities being planned in those spaces. So some also rehabilitation efforts are, yeah. So that's as much as I can share. But it's a great question, and I know a lot more can be done and is possibly going to be done.
Just seeing like all of these objects that people have preserved through generations, what I have seen in my family is something like most of my family members, like let's say for like 3 generations, we have had to move so much that we had to discard almost everything of what we owned. So everything that my father owns now, my mother owns now, nothing especially is passed down in material. And another thing that has happened in my family is the parents have somewhat not been open, I would say, to questions. So it's, this is just how it is.
Yes.
And not open to like, okay, a conversation. And now my grandparents are much more open. My parents are much more open to having a conversation, but they just don't remember anything because they don't know anything about their history and all of that. So, in such a scenario, like how do we recover the sort of like lost history, or what do we preserve?
No clear answers over there. Just from experience, I would say start documenting from now so that at least for the next generations, like people who are younger, like you're already very young, but there are people younger than you in your family, at least they could get some snippets of what you have grown up with. So everything has a value. So what you are seeing as new is something that your grandparents would have seen as new also. So I would say just start. So whatever is lost is lost. However, there are ways you can bring something back into the public consciousness. If you think that they're more open to talking about things now, you can begin. Like for instance, somebody just asked my father. He was like living through Emergency, and recently there was this controversy over the film Emergency. I think it's called Emergency. Yeah. So someone was asking my father, like my niece and nephew, and he was a bit uncomfortable because you'll also find that there are triggers. So it's not easy always. And here you have to look at the ethics of it, of data collection. Um, how do you work around people's discomfort? You've got to let them be and then circle back to them later on. So it's a bit of a lengthy process, but I would suggest, be mindful of triggers, things like wars, emergency. I think Some people were also staying in an area where there was a lot of Naxalite activity with very small children. So you will find that, some of these questions can be very unpleasant for people, if, however important they may be for us. So I think we should just enjoy the process and learn as much as possible, you know. So start with present day memories and think that you're archiving it for someone much younger for the future.
Actually, that last line segues into the question that I have. You said for the future. I wanted to hear your take on how perhaps years from now, one would look at social media as a repository of memories. I use Facebook and Instagram extensively, and within, and while it's not like a longitudinal study, I mean, I don't know what kind of time period that entails to conduct one, but having used especially Facebook for over, definitely over 10 years, um, simple things like it has a feature called memories, which like on today in this year, this is what you posted, or this is, and I like to look at that every chance I get, because that again triggers different memories of the same thing, which then you can help, one can piece together to make a whole, so this is a very personal experience that I had from a perspective of like a more structured research. What is your take on that?
This sort of reminds me of something which I didn't mention in the presentation. I didn't include it. But in the World Design Organization, I presented a poster called Technology Helps. It addresses the similar question. Technology helps us remember, but are we allowed to forget? So it looked at Facebook memories and how our consent has not been taken to revive those memories and throw them at us. So we've given away our rights to remember already to the tech giants. Now they've even taken away our right to forget because we may not want to see those memories. The other point that this addresses is that sometimes people change. So what I posted and I was sad about, say, 2 years ago, I may have changed today. So, for instance, the example that I gave in the poster is that, say, if my pet died 2 years ago, then maybe I've gotten over that loss because I've got a new pet. So, in which case, throwing up those memories at us may not be completely accurate, also. It's ill timed. So, what I had suggested is because it was a design conference, I suggested a design intervention where you create a sort of a sensor where the user, like all of us, we are given the agency to actually change from a red to an orange to a green based on whether we are still traumatized or whether we have moved on. So these are two binaries, and this is a middle portion where we're maybe just still a little nostalgic. So I think this question of digital memory is a very important one. It is a very good repository, although I think you would have to keep in mind the whole aspect of fake memory, um, because they may not still hold good. You may have changed. Um, our recollection of a particular event, the event may be the same, but how we recall it may have changed. And sometimes how people respond, like the trigger of responses on social media, which are immediate, that can also make us change our take on that. So it's a very, very volatile situation, but great for a study, I would say. You know, um, in fact, I've been doing some reading on comparing social media engagements to the Greek chorus in Greek mythology, where people comment on the action. They can be critical, they can be judgmental, they can be humorous, sarcastic, but then they just comment and push off. Sometimes they can influence the course of action also, especially the trollers. So good luck. That'd be lovely.
Ma'am, before the question, I actually wanted to add something to you just said because I worked in that space. So, the GDPR, which is the data privacy, which has been implemented in Europe, that actually gives us the right to be forgotten.
Yes.
So now you cannot, so retail outlets or tech companies, they cannot preserve your data beyond a certain point of time unless you give them explicit permission. So that way, that is kind of being taken care of. People are getting cognizant.
Yes, but
Yeah.
has that jurisdiction extended to
So
all
GDPR
countries?
is
I don't know
GDPR
that
is
data.
mostly in Europe, but in US also they have started implementing. I'm forgetting exactly what it's called, but it's already started implementing. But the only thing is, it's now only for the consumer-facing companies where you are sharing data through a transaction that they are capturing, like a retail purchase and so on. It's not for social media platforms where you are actually giving an express consent.
Yes.
So the trick here is very simple. Read what you're signing up for. We don't read the fine print. We just say agree, agree, agree. And that's where the problem starts. So anyways, my question is not around that. My question is not specifically on the presentation that you had, but it's something on the topic that you were talking about. I think, and I've read a lot about this, that one of our greatest power is our power to forget, right? And you are talking about memories. So when we are preserving something, like you were talking about your aunt who never grew up to be your aunt, right? Don't they come back to haunt you, or you know, uh, something like a breakup or a death in the family many years down the line, losing a pet? So don't they come back to haunt you when you just go through your archives? I remember that I lost one job quite a few years back. The T-shirt that they gave me on the day of the farewell, it was signed by everyone. It's a graffiti T-shirt. It's still there in my cupboard. Neither can I throw it, nor can I see it. So what to do about that?
Yes, you're completely right. Which is why I was arguing for greater agency to remember or forget with the user. So hence came the design of like the green, the orange, and the red, so that the user decides which memory they want to make public or to be reminded of. So that it doesn't again come the next year and the next year and next year. The same memories are repeated. So I completely get what you're saying. Uh, you're talking about digital memory, right? Okay.
I have it in my cupboard. So it's
Correct.
there with
Yes.
the T-shirt that I have is in my cupboard, right?
Correct.
So I can't throw it because it's something has got a lot of memories.
Yeah.
And at the same time, every time I see, it's a sign of my failure.
Yes.
I mean, I had to leave my job. I was not, I didn't do it willingly, right? So it reminds me of something that I couldn't do successfully.
Right.
At the same time, there's emotions attached. For many years, I worked there. So, it's a very difficult state to be in. Think of a breakup, right? If you have the old love letters and then you don't want to throw them, you don't want to keep them, you keep on reading them.
Yeah.
So something like that. I mean, I'm not talking about breakup, too old for that, but yeah, but the T-shirt, yeah.
Yeah, I completely get what you're saying. So I think memories can also be replaced, and we can also make new memories. I think that's the great thing about the mind and the brain. So I guess that's what keeps us going. I'm a great believer in making memories. I mean, we're all memory makers. So maybe instead of thinking of it as a failure, it could be a reminder of maybe how you moved on and where you are today, for example. That could be a new memory that you may want the teacher to be associated. You know, like how some of us look at old school report cards where, teachers say that she's never paid attention for 1 minute in the class, or she's a daydreamer, or, some people are even told you'll never go anywhere in life. So we can agonize about them, or we can laugh at them, seeing like, the fact that we all turned out right.